Okay. Hello and welcome. I am Valerie from ECC and I would like to introduce you to Sarah Ashcroft, who will be facilitating this session on employment law considerations as part of the ESG agenda. Sarah is a senior manager and solicitor in PricewaterhouseCoopers legal employment practice, described as providing user-friendly advice and invaluable insight. Sarah delivers focused and commercial support in contentious and non-contentious matters. A full biography for Sarah can be found on the conference website. Sarah will be reviewing the key social and governance considerations for employers in this session. Before I hand you over to Sarah, you can use the question and answers function to send any questions throughout the session, and there is chat available if you would like to add any comments at any point. I'm now delighted to hand you over to Sarah.
Thanks, Valerie, and hi everyone. Thank you all for joining this afternoon. As Valerie said, there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the workshop. So as I go through, if there's anything you want to ask a question on, then please put it into the Q&A tab and we will pick it up at the end as long as we've got time. So just to give a little bit of background, as Valerie mentioned, I'm an employment solicitor at PwC. So I advise clients across the whole host of employment law obligations, and I work with a real mix of clients from kind of colleges, universities. I work with BBC on equal pay. I do a lot of work internally at PwC, and then I work with a lot of international organisations as well. So hopefully I can give a fairly broad steer on some of the key things that we're seeing in the employment law space around this really hot topic of ESG. I just move on to the next slide. Obviously, the starting point for this conversation is, what is ESG? It's a real kind of buzz phrase at the moment, and I think a lot of sort of high-level messaging is going out around ESG. But what I want to really get to the bottom of today are actually what are some of the practical things we as organisations can be doing to support our employees as part of our ESG goals. So at a really high level, obviously ESG covers the environmental, social and governance responsibilities and impacts of organisations. So when we hear about ESG in the press at the moment, it's often in the corporate context. So thinking about the environmental impact of operations, social issues in supply chains like modern slavery, corporate governance obligations, things like that. So we hear a lot of stories around consumers choosing their products based on ethics and environmental impacts, and we hear about the government kind of increasingly regulating and monitoring around transparency. So obviously in recent years we've seen new legislation come in around modern slavery, gender pay gap, emissions. So at a really high level, that's what we all think about when we hear ESG. But what I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis as an employment lawyer working with clients is actually what this means in the employment context. And before we get onto that, I wanted to touch very briefly on what it maybe means for all of you in an education context, because obviously there's a slightly different slant there. So to me, kind of what I understand of ESG for education is making sure that we have environmentally and socially responsible institutions for students and communities, and also for our staff. So making sure that we're offering a really great place to work. And I think that those factors are going to increasingly play into decisions being made in coming years by investors, by students and by staff. And you obviously want to make sure that when you're looking at staff, you're attracting the best talent. Now, you'll have all experienced over the last couple of years, there's had to be a huge shift in the way that you all work. The education sector's really had to adapt enormously under very testing circumstances. And I suppose ESG really can be seen as an opportunity to carry on that modernisation process and make sure that the education institutions really work for students and the stakeholders. So I thought it might be quite interesting to just kick off with a quick poll to see of everyone in the workshop today, how many of you have been involved in kind of ESG conversations at your institutions? Have you actively been involved in any discussions around ESG planning or anything that might feed into ESG? Have a look at what the results are saying. It's a bit of a mixed bag. This is similar to the workshop that I ran this morning, actually. So the majority of people saying no, but then I think as we went on and we talked about some of the themes that I see coming out of ESG, actually I think people realise that perhaps they are actually involved in ESG conversations, but it's possibly just not being badged as that. So hopefully as we go on, you might find that actually you relate to certain themes we're talking about, and you see that actually those discussions are happening, but they possibly haven't been branded under the banner of ESG at this stage. So the purpose of this workshop, obviously I wanted to focus on the employment law context. So for the rest of the workshop, I'm going to ignore the environmental aspects of ESG and focus on social and governance. So looking at social first, I was trying to think kind of how can you summarise it really neatly? And I think in a nutshell, to me, social in the employment law context means doing the right thing for your staff. Now, that obviously touches on a potentially enormous range of areas. So I wanted to focus in on a few of the key themes that I'm seeing in the work that I'm doing. So wellbeing, obviously, is a crucial one for employers. It was before the pandemic, and given the huge changes that everyone's had to adapt to over the last couple of years, it's become even more important. So particularly in light of the increased mental health pressures that the pandemic has caused. So what that means for employers, I mean, the practical impacts of getting wellbeing wrong are huge. The cost of absences due to people being unwell, whether that's mentally unwell, physically unwell, is enormous to any organisation. And the legal risks around getting this wrong are also very big. So as an employer, any organisation has health and safety obligations towards its employees, and actually taking steps to assess and manage wellbeing risks is a crucial part of that experience, and making sure that you are fully complying with your health and safety obligations as an employer. So in practice, we've seen loads of organisations implement really great wellbeing offerings, so offering all kinds of different support and potentially flexing that support when people change the way that they're working so that they could still access it remotely, etc. So that's really positive, in that a lot of organisations now have really comprehensive wellbeing support packages in place. But in practice, what we've seen as being crucial to making that wellbeing support work is making sure that staff, and in particular managers, are fully trained on identifying wellbeing issues and addressing them and managing them. So that for me is the kind of key takeaway from this first point around social and wellbeing, is making sure that alongside any support you're offering to your staff and equally to your students, that appropriate training is given to people in management positions to identify and manage issues. So another quick poll, I'd be really interested to know how many of your institutions changed your wellbeing offering during the pandemic. So did you see different types of support being offered to staff during kind of working from home periods, etc.? Right, so the votes are all coming in, and it's pretty unanimous at the moment. So we're seeing most people saying yes, and that's certainly what we tended to see across the market, was actually mental health became such a priority, and people were having to access that support differently, meaning that wellbeing offerings necessarily had to change to reflect that. So that's really positive that seemed to happen in the majority of your organisations. Now, the next area, I'm just going to touch on it very briefly now, because it's diversity and inclusion, which is often what people think about when we think about the social aspects of ESG. It's a huge topic, and it's one that I'm particularly kind of invested in and passionate about. I do a lot of work in this space. So I've actually dedicated an entire slide to it on the next slide. So I'll come back to diversity and inclusion in a minute, and we'll just touch on hybrid working next. So the very fact that this conference today is being run virtually, as it was last year, is a sign of the way that our working practices have changed. So in a sense, hybrid working in the pandemic has kind of brought some real positives in terms of it's allowed us all to work a lot more flexibly, accommodate work-life balance a lot better, but it hasn't been without its challenges for employers. So obviously, with people now choosing to work in different ways, so some people being back in the workplace, other people still choosing to work from home, creating a bit of a divide potentially in the way that people work. And that is increasingly difficult for employers to ensure fairness across all employees and ensure they're treated the same despite working in very different ways. So at PwC, we fairly early on came out and implemented a formal hybrid working policy. So we said back in kind of early summer, look, we acknowledge that the way that our people work now has changed forever, and we're going to accept and accommodate that. So we will embed kind of formal flexible working within our working patterns, and we don't expect people to come back to the office full time. So that's one end of the spectrum. We've seen everything in between, really. We've seen some organisations expect employees back at the workplace full time as soon as that was legally permissible. And then we've seen others where people are still continuing to work in a hybrid way, but it's on a fairly informal basis. It's a bit of a kind of a wait and see situation. We'll see how it all pans out. There's a bit of uncertainty amongst employees around what will happen going forward. And all of those bring with it their own challenges. So I'd be really interested in understanding what the situation is at your own organisation. So if we do another quick poll to see effectively which of your organisations have implemented formal longer term hybrid working models. So you may have implemented some formal arrangements, you may have implemented informal arrangements, or you may have had kind of no longer term considerations around hybrid working put in place. Everyone can submit their votes and we'll see. Again, this is looking fairly similar to the workshop this morning. So the majority have informal arrangements in place, not very many with formal arrangements. Now, that is where we're seeing the majority of employers, and I suppose that the key challenge to flag around having informal arrangements is the extent to which the changes have been communicated to employees. And I've had a comment just now from Angela saying that the policy is still being developed and formalised. So I think that's where a lot of organisations are, is that they're getting there, and there will be a formal policy in place at some point. And I suppose the challenge there is around ensuring that employees have some clarity around the situation and not leaving it so long that they're in a position to argue that actually there's been an implied change to their terms of employment. Because what we're increasingly starting to see now is employees who've worked very successfully from home for the last 18 months or so now saying, you never made it clear that these arrangements were temporary. I've worked quite happily at home with no impact on my work for a long time now. Actually, you can't make me come back into the office. So we're seeing a lot of those kind of challenges coming up now. So actually having some clear employee comms around either this is under review, it's a temporary arrangement for the moment, we will be confirming, or putting in writing and confirming the position going forward. It's certainly something to be thinking about, particularly if you start seeing those challenges from employees, and certainly from conversations we've been having with employers in the education sector, that has been a bit of a challenge, adapting back to having to deliver teaching face to face, which is what a lot of students are expecting, but obviously a lot of teaching staff have got used to delivering those sessions from home and are quite happy doing so, and that transition back to delivering face-to-face teaching has been more challenging for organisations to manage. So we're going to touch on hybrid again shortly in relation to diversity and inclusion. So I'll just move on to industrial relations really briefly now. When it comes to trade unions, we're finding that these ESG commitments that organisations are making are giving trade unions a standard to hold employers to. So we're expecting to see increased union activity in terms of enforcing compliance. So where employers are saying these are our ESG targets, these are our commitments, we're expecting these trade unions to become quite vocal where those commitments relate to employee matters. We're expecting to see increased activity there. So for any of you that deal with trade unions, managing those relationships is likely to become even more important going forward. And I think any ESG targets around employment need to be considered with that lens as well. Right, so that's a whistle-stop tour of some of the key themes of the social aspect of ESG. And as I said, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the diversity and inclusion point. Now, there's a lot on this slide, so I'll talk it through kind of step by step, colour by colour. But working with clients, one of the key themes that's coming out of the S part of ESG is ensuring fairness for employees. And that really, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, is the underlying message of D&I initiatives. So where we've always looked from a D&I perspective at groups of employees based on protected characteristics, so things like gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, the key thing is making sure that those groups are treated fairly regardless of those characteristics. Now, touching back on the hybrid working point, another group we now need to consider are those who are working differently. So people who are working flexibly and might not be so visible in the workplace. We need to ensure that they're not being unintentionally disadvantaged as a result of those new ways of working. So these themes of looking at these groups of employees, and actually in the wider education context, groups of students, and making sure that they're being treated fairly is a key part of this social agenda. So when we hear companies and other organisations talking about ESG and diversity and inclusion, we hear a lot about kind of big picture goals and targets and very kind of top-down messaging about what the organisation's going to do to improve representation. The challenge then starts to filter down as to how do you actually make this happen. It's all well and good setting these kind of grand goals, but how do you implement them and make sure that you follow through? So that is the work that I do. That's the really difficult part of actually making those ground up changes to culture within an organisation. So at a practical employment level, what a lot of it boils down to and how you can actually make change is reviewing the policies and processes that impact staff on a day-to-day basis. So I've set out some examples in green on this slide. So you'll see I've put recruitment, work access and allocation, promotion, pay rises and bonus. It seems really straightforward, but they actually are the areas that we see issues cropping up repeatedly that then filter through to your wider diversity and inclusion statistics. So I do a lot of work in gender pay and equal pay, and where we identify issues within an organisation, we drill right down into these different processes and understand in practice how are they being applied to different groups of employees, and kind of at a really basic level, is there subconscious bias in these processes that's leading to people of a certain gender getting less access to good quality work, or to more people of a certain ethnicity being promoted or given pay rises, for example. So it seems really straightforward, and actually it is quite complex, sort of drilling down into how these are operating in practice. But at a really practical level, this is how you make change, and it's how you improve representation across your organisation, and you ensure that people are progressing at an equal rate and they're being paid fairly. So another quick poll. I'd be really interested to understand from your perspective at your organisation, what do you think is the biggest barrier to D&I, and what has the biggest impact on D&I issues of those areas? Obviously, you can only choose one, so I appreciate it's probably a combination of all of them, but what do you think is the single biggest factor impacting diversity and inclusion? It'll be interesting to see what you say, because the session this morning, we had a very clear winner, and we're certainly following that now. So this morning, recruitment came out as the key challenge from a diversity and inclusion perspective, and that's certainly something that we see, whether it's around the wording that's used in adverts, kind of putting off certain groups of employees, or whether it's around kind of challenges accessing certain demographics within society in certain roles or certain locations. It's a real challenge, and I think what we're seeing across all sectors at the moment is a real kind of boom in the market, and a real struggle to having a lot of vacancies and struggling to fill them, and a lot of competition out there. So having to pay real premiums to get good people in, which then in itself can give rise to further pay problems if you're bringing in people at increased rates, etc. So it's a real challenge at the moment, dealing with recruitment issues. But I think it's really important to not lose sight, when focusing on recruitment, to not lose sight of these other areas, because actually once you've got people in, you need to make sure that they're progressing through the organisation at a fair rate and being paid fairly. And it's interesting to see, once people join an organisation, you can see how their rates of progression might differ, or how their pay can go in very different directions. So this kind of holistic approach to looking at all of these policies and processes is really important in ensuring diversity and inclusion across across the workforce, really. And slightly outside of the employment context, but we've been having some really interesting conversations recently within the education sector about kind of data analytics. So we do a lot of data analytics around pay gaps amongst employees, but a lot of education organisations are wanting to understand the impact of these factors, so gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc., on attainment. So effectively understanding whether different groups of students are attaining different levels of outcomes from their courses. So again, if that's the case, then it's looking at what are the different kind of processes that apply to them, whether it's teaching processes, assessment processes, etc., and how are they impacting differently, and then giving rise to different outcomes for students. So again, you can look at this is obviously in the employment context, we're talking about this, but you can take these concepts a lot more broadly and understand, are certain students from certain backgrounds, certain demographics, hitting kind of barriers in terms of their education because of the processes we have in place, and are the changes that we can make to those to make it more inclusive and kind of encourage success for everybody. So Angela's mentioned in the chat the glass ceiling being an issue, and that's exactly the point around kind of promotion, work access, making sure that groups of people, kind of women in this situation, when we're talking about a glass ceiling, is often the case, that they're getting equal opportunity to progress through an organisation. So that glass ceiling is effectively caused by these different processes. So that is a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the diversity and inclusion considerations when we're talking about kind of social in the employment law context. So just want to jump on to governance now. So if summing up social was about doing the right thing, then I think that governance is about complying with obligations and getting it right. So at a really broad level, governance covers an enormous range of obligations that organisations have. So that covers things like corporate reporting, tax, etc. But I think often the employment law governance aspects get a bit overlooked. So in the employment law context, governance will cover things like statutory rights of employees, so looking at what they're entitled to in relation to pay and employment conditions, and also transparency initiatives like mandatory gender pay gap reporting that we're seeing kind of becoming more common in the UK in recent years. So again, I've pulled out some key themes that I wanted to touch on that we're seeing a lot of issues around at the moment. And the first one is kind of a broad theme of pay governance. So the government is really cracking down at the moment on making sure that employees are getting paid what they're entitled to. And it's taking quite an aggressive stance in certain areas. So national minimum wage is a great example. For the last few years, the government has been running kind of national minimum wage reviews of organisations, really in-depth technical kind of pay audits, and where they're finding non-compliance, and often it's kind of fairly minor technical non-compliance, they are publicly naming and shaming these organisations. So, I mean, some of you may have been involved in NMW reviews at your current organisations or in previous roles, and it's something that's certainly continuing. I think we're expecting the next round of naming and shaming fairly shortly. So there's certainly kind of no let up with it. And like all of these areas of employment law, the UK government loves a really complex piece of legislation, so none of it is easy to understand or comply with. So we're seeing an awful lot of organisations not being aware that they have compliance issues, and it's only when these reviews are underway that they're uncovering all sorts of problems. And it certainly is the case that a lot of organisations think, well, if we're paying kind of sufficiently above the national minimum wage, then we're fine. And actually recently we found examples of employees who've been paid kind of in excess of £40,000 a year who are falling foul of national minimum wage, which is crazy. But there's some real technical challenges and complexities around kind of deductions that are made from salary, hours that people work over and above their contracted hours, the way that people are classified and therefore calculated for national minimum wage purposes. It's a horrendously complex piece of legislation which has led to a lot of employers really falling foul of it. So it's definitely one to be aware of, particularly because the government is continuing to really focus on it. Now the next area I want to touch on under sort of pay governance is holiday pay. So we are seeing this as being the next national minimum wage, really. So we're expecting the government to take a similar approach to holiday pay as it has for NMW and effectively start carrying out reviews and naming and shaming. And what we're talking about when we talk about holiday pay is the way that people's pay while they're off on holiday is calculated and what they receive for any periods that they're off on holiday. So there's been a load of European case law in recent years that's basically changed the position from often employers just pay basic salary while people are on leave. And this case law has said, no, you shouldn't be paid your basic salary. You should be paid what you normally get paid so that you're not financially disadvantaged when you're off on leave. So what that means is that people who often work overtime or who get paid commission, etc., they should get those additional amounts of pay reflected in their holiday pay. Now, again, it's pretty complicated. Obviously, in the education sector, you're going to have the additional challenge of term time working, which makes the calculations a lot trickier. So another area to be aware of, and one that's going to come under increasing scrutiny as we go forward, particularly as the government has announced that it's going to create something called a single enforcement body, which effectively is going to be a task force to police and enforce compliance with various employment rights. And it's particularly designed to protect kind of vulnerable workers, and holiday pay and national minimum wage are two areas that have explicitly been stated will fall under that body and will be policed by them. So in coming years, we know there is going to be this new task force really focusing on those areas. Now, one other area I wanted to talk about in relation to pay governance is kind of gender equal ethnicity pay. So as I said, I do a lot of work in that space, and it's becoming an increasing issue. Now, progress in the sort of the gender pay space has really slowed as a result of the pandemic. So I don't know if any of you are involved in gender pay calculations, but what happened was that in 2020, the government suspended enforcement of publications. So what that led to was a lot of organisations not publishing their gender pay gaps for 2020. And then this year, the deadline was postponed from April to October. And again, a lot of organisations missed that deadline. So we seem to have gone backwards a little bit. We were making quite good progress as a country, as a nation. We were kind of going in the right direction. There was an increasing focus on it. And then understandably, the pandemic threw a bit of a spanner in the works, but seems to have kind of derailed progress in that space. So given the changes that we've had to workforces as well, with redundancies, furlough, lots of staff movement, we're expecting to see real kind of turmoil around pay fairness, particularly in relation to gender and ethnicity, and a lot of challenge because it's becoming increasingly high profile. We've seen so much in the press around equal pay issues. So it'll be really interesting to see kind of where we get to in that space, and particularly with ethnicity pay gap reporting being suggested as becoming mandatory. Now, the last point I want to touch on is status. So this is something that a lot of sectors are getting really wrong, and it's effectively how individuals, kind of how staff are being categorised. So you might have heard about the Uber and Deliveroo case law, where delivery drivers were kind of classified as self-employed, but actually it's turned out that they work more like employees and are therefore entitled to holiday pay, national minimum wage, sick pay, etc. There's recently been a case gathering momentum against a university, and it's to do with short course lecturers being classified as self-employed and therefore only being paid for their teaching hours, not paid for any prep time, they're not getting holiday pay, they're not getting sick pay. And there's this kind of legal case really gathering momentum and profile. So it's obviously something that's seeping into the education sector too. So again, it's something to be aware of and something to review as part of your wider ESG standpoint, kind of how you're engaging with staff and what rights they're entitled to and whether that's the right approach. And that kind of touches again on the single enforcement body. The other area they're really looking into is labour supply chains. So understanding what organisations' supply chains look like, who they're engaging with, how they're being provided with staff, whether that's agency staff, temp workers, etc., and whether people are being treated fairly and given the appropriate employment rights kind of down that supply chain. So again, it's this kind of wholesale looking at your organisation, ensuring that employees are being treated fairly and that they're getting everything that they're entitled to. So there's a lot of kind of practical implications of these wider social and governance angles that really hit at a kind of grassroots ground level when it comes to employment and employment law. So that was a real kind of whistle-stop tour of employment law and ESG. We've got about 5 minutes now for Q&A. If we want to move to that, I'll hand over to Valerie.
We have one question from David Williams. If informal working has now been allowed on an informal basis, could it now be seen as part of the employment contract on a custom and practice basis, and has this yet been tested in law yet?
Yeah, so thanks, David. And that's exactly the point that I was sort of raising earlier, is actually, yes, it could be seen as being part of the employment contract, depending on what communications have been made to employees, kind of how have they been kept up to date with the process? Have they been told that they're working from home on a temporary basis, or has there sort of been no communication? Has it been very quiet and that has just been allowed to continue? If there's been very little communication, then potentially there is a real argument for them to say, no, that's how I work now. There's no kind of cut-off time for when something becomes part of your employment contract. But we're arguably getting into territory now where if people have been working for a couple of years in that way, it's not been challenged and they've not been informed that it's temporary and under review, there could potentially be a strong argument. Now, it's not been tested in law yet, but I think it's only a matter of time. We're certainly seeing a lot of informal challenge on that basis across all sectors. So it's certainly one to watch this space on. And as a kind of a practical takeaway tip, actually, employee comms and just ensuring that kind of temporary or kind of hybrid working measures are under review and temporary at this stage could help to just provide a bit of a paper trail to show that there hasn't been a permanent change made to working practices.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Another question in from Angela Getty. Interesting to see equality appearing in social and governance. Who takes responsibility for delivering equal pay, or is this a shared responsibility?
So equal pay is an explicit legal obligation. So it's something that sits with an employer to ensure. Now, within an organisation, who takes personal responsibility for that can often be quite blurred. I see it sitting between an awful lot of roles within organisations. It might sit with HR, it might sit within kind of reward teams, it might sit with risk teams. It's a really tricky one because it varies from organisation to organisation. But yeah, equality and kind of that ensuring fairness point, which is really the underlying theme of equal pay, is crucial to ESG and is a real legal risk. So there's a lot of equal pay legal challenge going through the courts and tribunals at the moment, and when it goes wrong, it tends to go really wrong. It's very, very expensive. The example I always use is Birmingham City Council, who had a liability of over £1 billion for equal pay claims, and they had to sell the NEC to foot the bill for it. So yeah, it's certainly one to be looking at, but it's a very challenging area to get to grips with, because again, the law is very complex in that area. Who could compare themselves against one another is a lot broader than you might imagine. And yeah, as you mentioned, Angela, kind of where the responsibility sits within an organisation for testing and ensuring that is also very challenging. And I think the change we've seen in recent years around kind of, as I mentioned earlier, kind of recruitment premiums at the moment, a lot of staff movement, redundancies are all going to really contribute to equal pay challenges, because it's very hard to kind of get your arms around pay across a whole organisation and kind of test who should and shouldn't be getting paid equally.
Okay, I think that's it, Sarah. I don't think there's no more questions there. There's nothing in the chat. So if you're happy, we can end this session. And on behalf of ECC, I would like to thank you for delivering this session today. I hope that everyone is going to take away lots of information from this. So thank you, Sarah. Coming up next on the agenda, we have a break with some networking. So I would ask you all to take the time to take part in the networking carousel. Following the break, the conference closing remarks will be held in the lobby at 3:10 p.m. So thank you all, and thanks again, Sarah.
Okay, thanks ever so much, everyone. Thanks.